Well, it was November 10th, 1979. I was in a shopping mall record store looking for the latest release of my then favorite rock band. And there was a television screen in the record store, and the news broke of the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Iran and the capture of 66 American hostages. It became known as the Iran hostage crisis, and it came about 10 months after the Iranian Revolution, otherwise known as the Islamic Revolution. The figurehead of this Islamic Revolution was the former university lecturer of philosophy and the current religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini. The rallying cry of the Islamic Revolution was Allah Akbar, which I'm sure you've heard. It means God is great. Well, at the time I was 17 years old, not yet a believer, and it was my first introduction to Islam. I had mixed feelings, actually not mixed feelings, they were all negative feelings. I was angry, I was fearful, and I had hatred toward Muslims. But today I'm not going to focus on my journey from this introduction to Islam to how later God would lead Kathy and I to go and serve among Muslims. That's a story for another day. Today I want to focus on a group of people far different from me back in 1979. The people who knew and walked with Jesus and who loved Iranians. Those around the world who prayed for Iran and Iranians to have a chance to hear the gospel, to receive it, to experience the joy of salvation, to have a relationship with God through Jesus. I wonder, how did those people feel back in November 1979? The confusion, the disappointment, the questions that had to be in their minds. God, what are you doing? I've been praying for Iran for years, and this is the answer you're going to give? I've been praying for them to come to know you, and now they're going in the opposite direction. I've been praying for them to become followers of Jesus, and now they're followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini? Why would you let this happen? Does prayer even work? Have you ever had an experience like this in prayer? Where something you're praying for that you know is God's will, for people to come to faith, and yet it seems like everything's going in the opposite direction. Well, for the next 20 years in Iran, the fears of those praying for Iran played out in reality. Iranians became more devoted to Islam. Christians faced increasing opposition and persecution. All the missionaries were kicked out. Evangelism was outlawed. Bibles in Persian were banned and soon became scarce. And several pastors were murdered, killed, martyred for their faith. The hope of their prayers being answered just appeared to grow dimmer and dimmer, month after month, year after year. Iran appeared to be darker spiritually than it had been for decades, if not centuries. But then slowly, almost imperceivably, a shift began to occur. For the past 20 years, Iranians began to realize that a return to this deep devotion to Islam, the Islamic Revolution, didn't satisfy their deepest needs, their deepest spiritual needs, their deepest spiritual questions or longings. Iranians began to become disillusioned with Islam, and they started to seek truth in other places. The gospel started to enter into Iran through technology, such as satellite television, the internet, Bible apps on smartphones. Iranians started to come to faith As they came to faith, they shared their faith with friends and family members. As more and more people came to faith, they started to gather in house churches. When house churches started to get more than like 12, they started to get nervous that they would be discovered, so they would multiply into 2 churches. And in this way, the church just started to spread throughout Iran. About 15 years ago, I read an article about a house church that had gathered to worship God. And a neighbor heard this meeting going and heard them singing about Jesus, so he called the police to turn them in. After he called the police, he went downstairs to open the front door to let the police, when they came in, and to show them which house this house church was meeting in. And as he was standing there waiting at the door for the police to come, he started to listen to the words of the songs. And as he listened, this great conviction from God came upon him. And he started to ask himself, what am I doing? These are good people. They're worshiping God. Why am I turning them into the police? So he ran upstairs and he knocked on the door. He said, listen, you got to leave quick. I called the police. They're on their way. You've got to leave. And instead of responding like I would have, instead of being fearful and leaving, they calmly brought him in, made tea for him, shared the gospel. He came to faith and joined that house church. And you know what? The police never arrived. A few years later, in 2008, I led a short-term mission team from our church to Turkey to work with a long-term missionary who was serving Iranian refugees in Turkey. And we got to one night attend a house church in Cappadocia of about 25 Iranian believers. And after the service, I found one of the believers knew English, so I came to him and I started talking to him, and I told him, just before coming on this trip, I had read an article that said that they were estimating that there were 80,000 Iranian believers around the world. Now, I had served in Turkey. There's only 4,000 in all of Turkey. They've got a bigger population. I'm thinking, this can't be true. So I asked him, is it possible that there's 80,000 Iranian believers in the world? And he said, 80,000? No way, Ed. He said, I've been part of the underground church in Iran for 10 years. There are at least 1 million Iranians just in Iran, Iranian believers. 3 years ago, Operation World listed Iran as the fastest growing church in the entire world. Yes, those who prayed for Iran, they saw the fruit of their prayers. It didn't come on their timetable. Rarely do our prayers get answered on our timetable. But let this story of amazing growth of the Iranian church help us to follow the example of Paul and get excited about the impact of the gospel to the world, as Derek showed us from Colossians 1:6 last week. May it also be an encouragement to all of us as we gather every Monday and pray in our regional prayer groups, and we gather on Thursday morning to pray for unreached people groups and harvest prayer. For you, as you pray individually for people groups or countries that God's put on your heart. Yes, it's so easy for us to fall into the temptation that our prayers really aren't accomplishing that much. But the growth of the church in Iran shows us that though it may take years, God is able to do immeasurably more than we ask or imagine. Now, I can imagine a lot for Turkey. It's comforting to know that God can do more than that. So let's approach this college year with the faith that our prayers, our humble, simple, often uninformed prayers, can move mountains. Why? Because God is great. Indeed. May he be praised.